to see the comparison between the relative risk reduction and the attributable risk percent. So this we will use it when we are doing a intervention, for example, vaccination. For this is the relative risk reduction. So we want to see the relative risk, or it would be like a percent of the reduction of risk, and this is the attributable risk percent. So this would be the percentage of risk that could be attributable to the exposition. So here we're talking about, we have two groups in here. Here we have the placebo group, and here the intervened group. This intervened group could be, for example, give a vaccine or give a drug. And here we would have two groups: the group of exposed, for example, smoking, and the group of unexposed. And here the disease would be, for example, lung cancer. Here the disease is, for example, getting some infectious disease, and we're doing a vaccination. So the relative risk reduction is the ratio of the risk that could be attributable to the intervention. So is the rate of reduction that could be attributable to the intervention, to the good intervention. And here the percentage is the percentage that is in the same as saying the ratio, so that you will divide by 100, the ratio of risk that could be attributable to the exposition. We will see that it's quite the same thing, just that here the exposition is to intervene, is to do a good, and here the exposition is to do a bad thing or a risky thing, but it's quite the same thing. So let's suppose that here we have 80 people that without the vaccine was infected, 80 out of, let's say, 400. And here with the vaccine, just 20 out of 400 people. And here, if they smoke, also would be 80 out of 400 people. Let's say that in each group we have 400. So this is one example, this is another example, but I wanted to do the comparison to see that it's quite the same thing. In other video we have each one of these separate. So, and here, if they don't take the exposition, only 20 of these 400 get the disease. So, first, what is the relative risk? The relative risk in these two is depending on which relative risk we're talking, because the relative risk could be relative risk of this to this, of the placebo group with the intervened group, or the relative group of the intervened group in relation to the placebo group. So here, let's say relative risk of placebo group to intervened group, this would be 80 over 400 divided by 20 over 400, this would be 4. Here also the relative risk now of the interviewed group divided by the, or in relation to the placebo group, would be 2 over 8, would be 1/4 or 0.25. Here the same, the relative risk of the exposed group to the unexposed group is exposed to unexposed is 4, and the relative risk of the unexposed to exposed would be 0.25. Alright, now the attributable risk. Here the attributable risk is how much risk could be attributable to the exposition. So how much risk we can attribute is if we have 80 out of 400 that got the disease on the exposed group and 20 out of 400 that got the disease on the unexposed group. This would be 60 over 400. This is the attributable risk. This is the same as 6 out of 40, 3 out of 20. 3 over 2 is 1.5, over 10 is 0.15. So 0.15 is the attributable risk. We are not talking about the attributable risk, but here we talk about the attributable risk reduction, but it's exactly the same thing, is how much risk reduction we can attribute to the intervention. So it's before the intervention 80 out of 400 got the disease, and now with the intervention just 20 out of 400 got the disease. So it's 60 divided by 400 is the same, 0.15. So in both we're taking the larger number of people that got the rate larger and subtracting the less number. Here in both we to 80 over 400 we subtract 20 over 400, but in this case is the exposed group minus the unexposed group. In a sense is the interviewed group, or the exposed versus the control group, we want to say it like that. And here is like the other way around. Here is like the placebo group minus the intervened group. So it depends if we are talking about a exposition that is a exposition to a risk factor, or a exposition to something that could negate the risk. And yeah, obviously there could be things like maybe we find that smoking is good, and so instead of having here 80 we'll have 10%. So here the attributable risk would be quite the other way around, sort of thing. But we are talking about most of the times when do the vaccine or the drug it gets better, and when the group of the exposed group gets worse with the exposition. So the attributable here, when we have a group and another group, this group is getting exposed to some risk factor. This is the attributable risk. We calculate the attributable risk, and here when we have a group that is placebo and other that is vaccine or drug that we're trying, we talk about attributable risk reduction, because this is how much risk we can attributable to the exposition, and here's how much risk reduction we can attribute to the vaccination or to the drug. So it's the same, but here it's called attributable risk reduction, and here is attributable risk. And in the relative risk, for each case we can calculate two different relative risks depending on if it is the rate of this to this or the other way around. But usually when we do the relative risk, we are talking about the relative risk of the intervened or the exposed to the unintervened or to the placebo group. So in this case, the intervened group would be the one that is exposed. It is not quite good to say intervened because we are talking about observational studies. So here we're talking about observational studies, and here we're talking more about the clinical trial in a sense. So what is quite that here the relative risk that most often we do is the relative risk of the exposed to the unexposed. So it's this, and here the relative risk that we calculate is again the intervened over the placebo group. So it would be this divided by this. So that is this. So for that, when we just say the relative risk without specification by autonomously, the relative risk we were talking about the exposition group is the exposed group divided by the unexposed group. So the rate of the disease on the exposed group divided by the rate of the disease on the unexposed group, that is 4. And here, having exactly the same number would be the relative risk of the vaccinated group over the placebo group, that is 0.25%. So even though in these two cases we can have, in both we can have 4 and in both we can have 0.25, but because we usually do like the intervention over the placebo, so here we have most of the time we just say relative risk, it will be 4, and here when we just say relative risk would be 0.25, so would be this over this, and here would be this over this. So that is other thing that can get confused, because now we're going to enter to the relative risk reduction. Alright, so and to the attributable risk percent, but I think that we will continue this on the next video, with just doing the acceleration that the attributable risk is quite the same to the attributable risk reduction, just that in different studies, and the relative risk could be the same if we would have the same numbers, etc. Could be the same, but by antonomy when we say relative risk on the observational study is the exposed over the unexposed. So when they got more the disease over the and here is the placebo group over the intervened group. So in the next video we will talk about the relative risk reduction and attributable risk percent.